You kept this from me?" The wealthy billionaire CEO confronted his ex-wife, then noticed the newborn twins she was hiding. The mahogany doors of the executive suite swung open, and Wesley Gregg looked up from his quarterly reports to see a ghost from his past. Doris Clifford stood in his doorway, her emerald eyes blazing with fury, carrying 2 infant car seats that made his pen slip from his trembling fingers. "Doris," he whispered, his voice catching. "What are you doing here? What are those?" "Hello, Wesley." Her voice could have frozen hell itself. "Meet your children." His eyes darted to the car seats, to the tiny fists visible through soft blankets, and his world tilted off its axis. "My what?" "Lucas and Grace," she said, setting the carriers down with deliberate precision. 11 weeks old, born January 15th, your son and daughter that you knew absolutely nothing about because you were too busy planning your wedding to Isabella Montenegro. "You were pregnant?" The words came out strangled, desperate. "When you disappeared 8 months ago, you were carrying my children?" "I was 7 months pregnant when I watched you announce your engagement on the evening news." Her laugh was bitter, sharp enough to cut glass. "Imagine my surprise, Wesley, finding out my boyfriend of 2 years was marrying a pharmaceutical heiress while I was buying maternity clothes. I never meant for you to find out that way. I tried to call you to explain." "Explain what exactly? That you chose a $3 billion merger over the woman who loved you? That Isabella's daddy's pharmaceutical empire was more important than what we had? Save your explanations for someone who still believes them." Wesley stood slowly, his legs unsteady as he approached the car seats. 2 perfect babies slept peacefully, completely unaware that their existence had just detonated his carefully constructed life. "They're mine," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Biologically, yes. In every other way that matters, they're mine alone. I've been their entire world for 11 weeks, Wesley. Every sleepless night, every diaper change, every feeding. Where were you?" "You never told me." "Would it have changed anything? Would you have canceled the merger, called off the engagement, or would you have tried to have it all, your pharmaceutical princess and your secret family tucked away somewhere convenient?" The accusation hit him like a physical blow because they both knew the answer. 8 months ago, he would have chosen the merger. 8 months ago, he'd been a different man who measured worth in market shares and thought love was a luxury successful people couldn't afford. Have you ever made a choice so catastrophically wrong that it haunted every quiet moment for months? Have you ever realized too late that you threw away everything that mattered for something that meant nothing at all? What would you do if the person you betrayed walked back into your life carrying the consequences you never knew existed? This is the story of Wesley Gregg, a man who built an empire but lost his soul, and the moment when the universe presented him with a bill he never knew was coming due. It's a story about second chances that have to be earned, not demanded. About transformation that comes through action, not words. About discovering that true wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with the tiny hands that might never learn to trust you. If you believe in redemption, if you think people can change when the stakes are high enough, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear that our worst mistakes don't have to be our final chapter. And subscribe, because this journey is about to get complicated in ways you won't see coming. Let me tell you how we got here, to this moment when Wesley's perfectly ordered world exploded into chaos and possibility. 3 years earlier, Wesley Gregg had been named one of Forbes's 40 under 40 for building a biotechnology empire from nothing. Gregg Industries was his masterpiece, a pharmaceutical research company that developed life-saving treatments for rare diseases. On paper, his life was perfect. Corner office in Manhattan, penthouse apartment with Central Park views, investment portfolio worth more than most small countries' GDP. But success has a way of isolating you, especially when you start believing your own press releases. Wesley worked 18-hour days, attended charity galas because they were good for business, dated women who looked perfect on his arm, and wanted nothing deeper than surface-level charm. He'd convinced himself this was living, that achievement was the same thing as fulfillment. Then, Doris Clifford had walked into his life like a hurricane in human form. She'd been hired as the head of pediatric research at Gregg Industries, brilliant and passionate about using science to help children. Where Wesley saw profit margins, Doris saw possibilities. To change lives, where he calculated risk and reward, she calculated human impact. She challenged every assumption he'd made about business, about success, about what actually mattered. Their first meeting had been a disaster. Wesley had presented her with a cost-cutting proposal that would have eliminated funding for a rare childhood cancer research program. Doris had listened politely, then systematically destroyed his argument with facts, figures, and a moral clarity that left him speechless. Mr. Gregg, she'd said, her green eyes flashing with righteous anger, I understand you're a businessman first, but I'm a scientist first, and these children don't care about your quarterly earnings. They care about living to see their next birthday. Most people were intimidated by Wesley's reputation and wealth. Doris treated him like any other person who needed to be educated about what really mattered. It was intoxicating. For the first time in years, someone was challenging him to be better, instead of just telling him how impressive he already was. Their professional relationship had evolved slowly, cautiously, into something personal. Late-night conversations about research goals that turned into discussions about dreams and fears and the kind of life worth building. Dinners that started as work meetings and ended with them talking until sunrise about everything except work. Wesley had fallen in love with her mind first, the way she approached problems with creativity and compassion he'd never encountered in the corporate world. Then he'd fallen in love with her laugh, the way she could find humor in the darkest situations. Finally, he'd fallen in love with her heart, the fierce protectiveness she showed for anyone vulnerable, the way she made him want to be worthy of her respect. For 2 years, they'd built something real. Not the strategic partnerships Wesley was used to, but actual love based on shared values and mutual challenge. Doris made him want to use his resources for more than accumulation. She inspired research programs that prioritized patient outcomes over profit margins. She made him remember why he'd started the company in the first place, back when he'd believed business could be a force for good. Wesley had been planning to propose. He'd had the ring designed, an emerald surrounded by diamonds that matched her eyes. He'd been researching venues, imagining a life where their shared passion for healing could become a shared legacy. Then, Isabella Montenegro had appeared at a pharmaceutical industry gala, and everything had changed. Isabella's father controlled Montenegro Pharmaceuticals, a European conglomerate with research facilities in 12 countries and distribution networks Wesley could only dream of. Accessing. Their conversation had started as polite networking, but Roberto Montenegro had a different agenda entirely. My daughter needs a husband, he'd said bluntly over expensive whiskey. Someone established, respected, with complementary business interests, a strategic alliance that would benefit both our companies immensely. Wesley had laughed it off initially. He was in love with Doris, planning a future with her. But Roberto was persistent, painting pictures of merged empires and global impact that would dwarf anything Wesley could accomplish alone. The merger would make him one of the most powerful men in pharmaceuticals overnight. Love is for poets, my boy, Roberto had said. Successful men make successful partnerships. Isabella is beautiful, educated. She understands the demands of business. She won't challenge your priorities or make emotional demands. Think of what you could accomplish together. The seed of temptation had been planted, and Wesley's worst instincts had begun to water it. His relationship with Doris was passionate but complicated. She pushed him constantly, demanded he examine his motivations, questioned decisions that prioritized profit over people. It was exhilarating but exhausting. Isabella represented something easier, a partnership based on mutual benefit rather than mutual challenge. Wesley had begun spending more time with Isabella, telling himself it was just business networking. She was everything Roberto had promised, beautiful and sophisticated, and completely undemanding. She never questioned his priorities or challenged his assumptions. She accepted his 12-hour workdays without complaint, attended business functions with grace, and made it clear that a marriage between them would be about shared goals, not messy emotions. The proposal had come during a board meeting where Roberto had outlined the merger benefits in detail. Combining their companies would create a pharmaceutical giant with unprecedented research capabilities and global reach. The marriage between Wesley and Isabella would cement the partnership, ensuring stability and mutual trust between the organizations. Wesley had said yes before fully processing what he was agreeing to. The business logic was overwhelming. The merger would triple his net worth and give him access to research facilities he'd never be able to build independently. Isabella was offering a partnership without the emotional complexity that sometimes made his relationship with Doris feel like navigating a minefield. He'd convinced himself he was making a mature decision, choosing practicality over sentiment. He'd told himself that real success required sacrifice, that he could have love or power but not both. He'd rationalized that Isabella would make a better life partner for someone in his position, someone who understood that business came first always. Breaking up with Doris had been the hardest thing Wesley had ever done. She'd listened to his carefully prepared speech about different priorities and incompatible long-term goals with growing disbelief. You're choosing her, Doris had said quietly. You're choosing the merger over us. I'm choosing what makes sense for both of us, Wesley had replied, hating himself even as he spoke. We want different things, Doris. You want to save the world. I want to build something lasting. I thought we were building something lasting together. This is better for everyone. You'll find someone who shares your idealism. I need someone who understands the realities of business. Doris had nodded slowly, tears threatening but never falling. I hope the realities of business keep you warm at night, Wesley. I hope your merger makes you happy. I hope Isabella's father's approval fills whatever hole you're trying to fill with other people's validation. Then she'd walked out of his life, leaving only a resignation letter and a forwarding address he'd been too proud to use. The engagement announcement had run in the business section of the New York Times 3 weeks later. Wedding plans had moved forward with the efficiency of a corporate merger, which in many ways it was. But Wesley's nights had been haunted by memories of emerald eyes and passionate arguments about research priorities and the way Doris had challenged him to be more than just successful. He told himself it was normal pre-wedding anxiety, that he'd chosen correctly, that practical partnerships were more sustainable than emotional ones. The marriage to Isabella had lasted exactly 4 months. She was everything promised, beautiful and accommodating, and completely uninteresting. Their conversations never went deeper than social calendars and business strategy. Their life together was perfectly orchestrated and soul-crushingly empty. Wesley had realized with growing horror that he'd traded everything meaningful for something that looked impressive in business magazines. Isabella was a wonderful woman who deserved someone who could love her completely, not someone pining for the woman he'd thrown away for a stock portfolio. The divorce had been amicable and expensive. Isabella had kept the Montenegro merger benefits and wished Wesley well in finding someone more suited to your emotional needs. Roberto Montenegro had been less gracious, making it clear that Wesley had burned bridges that couldn't be rebuilt. For 4 months, Wesley had been alone with his empire and his regret, wondering if Doris had found someone who appreciated her passion, if she was happy, if she ever thought about what they'd almost built together. He drafted countless emails he never sent, rehearsed phone calls he never made, driven past her old apartment building like a stalker hoping for a glimpse of forgiveness he didn't deserve. Now she stood in his office holding the consequences of timing he'd never considered. 2 babies who carried his DNA and her strength, who represented the family they could have had if he'd been brave enough to choose love over strategy. "How long have you been back in New York?" Wesley asked, his voice barely steady. "I never left," Doris replied, watching him process this information. "I've been here the entire time, Wesley. 30 minutes from your office raising our children alone while you played house with Isabella." The words hit him like physical blows. She'd been here, through her entire pregnancy, through giving birth alone, through 11 weeks of sleepless nights and first smiles and everything he'd missed. She'd been 30 minutes away while he'd been convinced she'd disappeared from his life entirely. "I looked for you," he said desperately. "I went to your apartment. I moved 2 weeks after we broke up. Did you think I'd stay in a place where every corner reminded me of what we'd planned together? Did you think I'd torture myself watching you build a life with someone else?" One of the babies stirred in their carrier, making the soft mewing sounds that precede real crying. Doris immediately knelt beside the car seat, her entire demeanor shifting to something tender and protective as she lifted a tiny girl with dark hair and Wesley's unmistakable green eyes. "Shh, Grace," Doris murmured, and the baby settled immediately against her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mama's here." Wesley felt his heart shatter watching them together, seeing the bond he'd missed, the love he'd forfeited through his own choices. Grace was perfect, a miniature person who carried pieces of both her parents and features still developing but already heartbreakingly beautiful. "Can the first—" he started, then stopped, not sure he had any right to ask. "Hold her?" Doris finished, her tone carefully neutral. "I suppose you should meet your daughter properly." She transferred Grace to Wesley's arms with practiced efficiency, showing him how to support her head, how to position her against his chest for security. The baby weight was nothing and everything, 7 pounds of absolute perfection that made every business achievement Wesley had ever celebrated seem laughably insignificant. "Hello, Grace," he whispered, and his voice cracked on her name. "I'm your father. I'm so sorry I wasn't there when you were born." Before I continue with this life-changing moment that's about to reshape Wesley's understanding of what actually matters, I need to speak directly to you. We're watching a man confront the consequences of choosing security over authenticity, of prioritizing what looked impressive over what actually mattered. Maybe you've been where Wesley is right now, realizing you made the wrong choice when it counted. Maybe you're where Doris stands, protecting something precious while deciding whether forgiveness is possible. Or maybe you're just here because you believe broken things can be rebuilt, if both people are willing to do the work. This story is about to test everything we think we know about redemption and transformation, about whether second chances can be earned through action rather than demanded through entitlement, about the terrifying possibility that people can actually change when the stakes become personal enough. If this journey is resonating with you, if you want to see whether Wesley can prove himself worthy of the family he threw away, show me by hitting that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to believe that our worst moments don't define our entire story. And subscribe, because trust me, what happens next is going to challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness and family. Now back to Wesley's office, where a man is holding his daughter for the first time and discovering that everything he thought mattered was just an expensive distraction from what actually matters. Grace opened her eyes and stared up at Wesley with the unfocused but curious gaze of someone discovering the world one face at a time. Her tiny fist curled around his finger with surprising strength, and Wesley felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This was his daughter, his child, and he'd missed 11 weeks of her life because he'd been too cowardly to choose love over appearances. "She's perfect," he whispered, tears threatening despite his efforts at control. "Yes, she is," Doris agreed, settling back into her chair while keeping one eye on the second car seat where Lucas was beginning to stir. "They both are, which is why I kept them away from you for 8 months, Wesley, because I needed to make sure they stayed perfect." The words hung in the air like an indictment, which they were. Wesley absorbed them with visible pain, his composure cracking in ways the younger version of himself never would have allowed. "I deserve that," he said quietly. "I deserve much worse than that." "Yes, you do. But we're not here to discuss what you deserve. We're here because circumstances have changed, and you have a right to know your children exist. Whether you have a right to be in their lives is something we'll determine over time." "What circumstances changed?" Wesley asked, though he dreaded the answer. Doris pulled a folder from her diaper bag and slid it across his desk. "This." Wesley opened it with one hand while still holding Grace, finding himself looking at legal documents and financial statements that made his blood run cold. Child support calculations, custody arrangement templates, documentation that would make their situation public record if filed. "You're taking me to court?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "I'm giving you a choice," Doris corrected. "I could file these papers tomorrow and let the legal system decide how much of their lives you get access to. Family court loves stories about billionaire fathers who abandon pregnant girlfriends for strategic marriages. The media would have a field day with Wesley Gregg, pharmaceutical prince who chose a merger over his own children. Or you can prove that you've learned something in the past 8 months, that you can be a real father, not just a monthly check and awkward holiday visits, that you can choose them consistently, even when it's inconvenient or complicated or conflicts with more important priorities." Lucas chose that moment to wake up fully, his soft fussing escalating to the particular cry that meant immediate attention was required. Doris stood smoothly, lifting him from his carrier with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this alone for 11 weeks. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, checking his diaper with one hand while supporting his head with the other. "You're okay. Mama's got you." Wesley watched this exchange with growing awareness of how much he'd missed, how much he didn't know about caring for infants, how completely unprepared he was for the reality of parenthood. Lucas was smaller than Grace, with wisps of brown hair and features that were still developing, but already showed hints of both parents. "Can I hold him too?" Wesley asked hesitantly. "After we establish some ground rules," Doris replied, settling into the chair with Lucas against her shoulder. "If you want to be their father, Wesley, it has to be real. Not photo opportunities for your public image, not convenient weekend visits when you're not traveling for business. These are children who need consistency, not a part-time parent who shows up when it works with his schedule." "I understand that," Wesley said immediately. "I want to be their father, really be their father." "Do you? Because 8 months ago you wanted a merger more than you wanted me. You wanted Isabella's father's approval more than you wanted our relationship. You wanted comfort over commitment. What's different now?" Wesley was quiet for a long moment, looking down at Grace, who had fallen asleep against his chest with the complete trust that babies showed to anyone holding them securely. Her breathing was soft and steady, her tiny features relaxed in sleep that spoke of absolute security. "Everything," he finally said. "Everything is different. 8 months ago I was building an empire and measuring success in stock prices and market share. I thought achievement could substitute for living, that accomplishing impressive things was the same as being happy. I was wrong about everything that mattered." "Well, pretty words," Doris observed, her tone carrying the same skepticism that had haunted Wesley's dreams for months. "But I've heard your pretty words before, Wesley. They didn't mean much when you were planning your wedding while I was buying maternity clothes." "You're right," Wesley admitted, the honesty scraping his throat raw. "Words are worthless. I'll prove it through actions. However long it takes, whatever you need to see, I'll prove that these children and you are more important than anything else I thought I wanted." "Me?" Doris raised an eyebrow. "This isn't about me, Wesley. Whatever we had died when you chose Isabella. This is about Lucas and Grace having a father who shows up consistently, who prioritizes their needs over his convenience, who understands that love is a verb, not just a feeling." Before Wesley could respond, Lucas began crying in earnest, the particular wail that experienced parents recognize as hunger rather than discomfort. Doris immediately shifted into feeding mode, pulling a bottle from the diaper bag with movements that spoke of countless repetitions. "I need to feed him," she said, settling Lucas into the crook of her arm. "This conversation can continue, but he doesn't care about adult drama when he's hungry." Wesley watched, fascinated despite the tension, as Doris tested the bottle temperature against her wrist before offering it to Lucas, who latched on immediately with satisfied sounds. The intimacy of the moment, the complete focus required for infant care, drove home how much of their early lives he'd already missed. "I want to learn all of this," Wesley said quietly. "I want to know their schedules, their preferences, how to tell the difference between their cries. I want to be useful, not just present." "It takes time," Doris replied, adjusting Lucas's position as he fed. "Months to really understand their rhythms, their needs, their individual personalities. You can't catch up on 11 weeks in one conversation, Wesley." "I know. But I want to try. I want to be here as much as you'll allow me to be." "Here meaning what exactly? Are you planning to commute to wherever I'm living for weekend visits? Fly the nanny and babies to Manhattan when it's convenient for your schedule? How exactly do you envision this working?" The question cut to the heart of the logistical nightmare Wesley was only beginning to understand. His life was built around a Manhattan office and penthouse apartment, charity galas and business dinners that ran until midnight. Doris had built her life around the needs of 2 infants who required feeding every 3 hours and didn't care about quarterly earnings reports. "Where are you living?" he asked. "Boston," Doris replied, watching his face for reaction. "I have an apartment near Massachusetts General where I work in the neonatal intensive care unit. Night shifts mostly. The pay is good and my neighbor Mrs. Patterson watches the twins while I'm at work." Wesley felt the ground shift beneath him again. "You're working nights with 11-week-old babies? Doris, you don't have to do that. I can support you, support them, whatever you need financially." "I don't want your money," Doris said firmly, her green eyes flashing with the independence that had first attracted him years ago. "I didn't come here for child support or financial arrangements. I came here to give you the opportunity to be their father if you can prove you're capable of prioritizing them over everything else that's always been more important to you. Then what do you want? What would convince you that I'm serious about this?" Doris finished feeding Lucas and shifted him to her shoulder for burping, the movements automatic and precise. "Consistency, Wesley. Showing up when you say you will, being present when you're with them, not distracted by phone calls or business emergencies. Learning their needs and preferences instead of assuming expensive gifts can substitute for actual attention." "I can do that," Wesley said immediately. "Can you? Can you really restructure your entire life around the needs of 2 infants? Can you prioritize their bedtime routine over business dinners? Can you change diapers at 2 in the morning without resenting the disruption to your schedule?" The challenges she was outlining should have terrified him. Wesley's life had been carefully orchestrated for maximum efficiency and minimal personal demands. He'd never been responsible for anyone who couldn't be managed with delegation and strategic planning. But looking at Grace sleeping peacefully in his arms and Lucas settling contentedly against Doris's shoulder, Wesley felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose, the possibility of building something that mattered more than profit margins. "I can learn," he said. "I want to learn. I want to be the father they deserve, even if I have no idea what I'm doing." Learning isn't enough, Wesley. You have to want it more than you want comfort, more than you want the path of least resistance. Parenthood is hard, exhausting, completely consuming. It changes everything about how you structure your time and priorities. Are you ready for that kind of transformation? Wesley considered the question seriously, thinking about the life he'd built that suddenly felt hollow and purposeless. The penthouse apartment that echoed with emptiness. The business achievements that impressed strangers but left him feeling completely alone. The carefully curated existence that looked successful from the outside but felt like an expensive prison. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it. "I'll prove it to you. However long it takes, whatever tests you need to put me through, I'll show you that I can choose them over everything else." Doris studied his face with the intensity of someone reading a contract for hidden clauses. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy some internal requirement, because she nodded slowly. "We'll start small," she said. "I'm not moving back to New York, Wesley. Boston is our home. The twins have a pediatrician there. I have a job I love, a support system I've built over the past 8 months. If you want to be part of their lives, you'll have to come to us." "I'll drive up every weekend," Wesley said immediately. "More often if you'll allow it, whatever schedule works for you and them." "We'll try every other weekend to start," Doris countered. "Let them get used to the idea of having a father gradually, rather than overwhelming them with constant disruption. You can call during the week if they're comfortable with it, but Wesley, if you commit to this schedule, you commit completely. You don't get to cancel because of business emergencies or travel conflicts. You don't get to let them down the way you let me down." The reference to their broken relationship hung between them, and Wesley saw Doris immediately regret bringing up personal history that was supposed to be irrelevant to CEO parenting arrangements. But the parallel was too obvious to ignore. Wesley had made promises to Doris that he'd broken when something more attractive appeared. Now she was trusting him with something infinitely more precious and vulnerable. "I won't let them down," he promised, his voice carrying the weight of an oath. "Whatever happens between us personally, whatever you decide about me as a person, I will be consistent for them. They will be able to count on me." "We'll see," Doris replied, which wasn't acceptance but wasn't dismissal either. It was the beginning of a chance, the opening of a door that had been slammed shut 8 months ago. They spent the next hour working out practical details. Wesley's first visit to Boston would happen the following weekend. 2 hours initially, enough time for him to meet the twins in their normal environment without disrupting their routine too dramatically. Background checks and legal documentation that would formalize his parental rights while protecting Doris's primary custody. Financial arrangements that acknowledged his obligation while making clear she didn't need his money to provide for their children. Every detail was negotiated carefully, building a framework that would allow Wesley into their lives without risking the stability Doris had fought to create alone. Through it all, the twins remained mostly content, occasionally fussing but settling quickly when their needs were met with practiced efficiency. As the afternoon progressed, Wesley found himself studying every detail of his children, trying to memorize features that would change rapidly in the coming months. Grace had longer eyelashes than Lucas, but the same stubborn chin. Lucas had more hair, but Grace's nose was more defined already. Both had tiny fingernails that seemed impossibly perfect, and expressions that shifted constantly as they processed whatever dreams or sensations occupied infant consciousness. "I need to get back to Boston," Doris said eventually, checking her watch with the time awareness of someone whose life revolved around feeding schedules. "Mrs. Patterson is expecting us by 6, and they'll need to eat again before bed." "When will I see them again?" Wesley asked, hating how desperate he sounded, but unable to moderate his tone. "Next Saturday if you want, but Wesley, I meant what I said about being present. When you're with them completely. No phone calls, no business emergencies that suddenly require your attention. 2 hours of focused time where they are your only priority." "Understood," Wesley said immediately. "Completely understood." Doris gathered the diaper bag and began transferring the twins back to their car seats with the efficiency of someone who'd perfected this routine through necessity. Wesley watched every movement, trying to learn the techniques she'd mastered through 11 weeks of solo parenting. "Can I walk you to your car?" he offered. "That's not necessary," Doris replied, but her tone had lost some of its earlier edge. "We can manage." "I know you can manage," Wesley said gently. "You've been managing everything alone for almost a year. I just want to help carry something, even if it's just a car seat to the parking garage." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she nodded once. "The diaper bag is heavy. You can carry that." The elevator ride to the parking garage was quiet, except for the occasional sound from the twins, who seemed content in their carriers. Wesley found himself hyper-aware of Doris standing beside him, the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with the baby soap smell that clung to all new parents, the careful way she held herself apart from him while staying close enough to monitor the car seats. "Thank you," she said quietly as they reached her car, a practical sedan that had clearly been chosen for safety ratings rather than style. For today, for agreeing to the arrangements, for wanting to be their father. "Thank you for giving me the chance I don't deserve," Wesley replied, "for telling me about them instead of just filing papers and letting lawyers handle everything." Doris loaded the car seats into their bases with practiced precision, checking and double-checking the security systems before closing the doors. Wesley handed her the diaper bag, their fingers brushing briefly in the transfer, and he felt the same electric awareness that had always existed between them. "I'll see you Saturday," Doris said, opening her driver door but pausing before getting in. Wesley, don't make me regret this. Don't make promises you can't keep or commitments you won't honor. They're too young to understand disappointment now, but they won't be children forever. I'll be there, Wesley promised. On time, present, ready to learn whatever you're willing to teach me about being their father. As Doris drove away, Wesley stood in the parking garage watching the taillights disappear, feeling like his entire life had been reorganized in the space of 3 hours. The twins existed. He was a father. 8 months of careful emotional distance from his past had just exploded into the possibility of a future he'd never imagined wanting. Before I tell you what happens next, before I show you whether Wesley can actually transform from the man who chose comfort over commitment into someone worthy of being called a father, I need to speak to you about the hardest part of change. It's not the dramatic moments, the big gestures, the public declarations of transformation. It's the daily choice to show up when you're tired, to prioritize someone else's needs when yours feel more urgent, to prove through small, consistent actions that you've actually learned from your mistakes instead of just feeling guilty about them. Most people who hurt others never do the work of genuine change. They apologize, they make promises, they perform regret for as long as it takes to be forgiven, then they slip back into the same patterns that caused damage in the first place. Real transformation is rare because it requires admitting not just that you were wrong, but that you have to become a fundamentally different person. If you've ever been where Wesley is now, if you've ever had to prove that you'd changed after making choices that hurt people you loved, hit that like button. If you believe people can actually transform when the stakes become personal enough, share this with someone who needs hope that redemption is possible through action, not just intention. Drop a comment telling me about your own experiences with second chances. Have you ever had to rebuild trust you'd shattered? Have you ever given someone an opportunity to prove they'd changed? I read every comment, and your stories matter to this community we're building. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what happens next is going to test everything Wesley thinks he knows about sacrifice and priorities. The real challenge is just beginning. Now let me show you what happened when Wesley tried to become the father he'd never learned to be. That weekend, Wesley drove to Boston with a back seat full of research materials he'd never expected to need. Parenting books and infant development guides, articles about attachment theory and sleep training, everything he could find about caring for 11-week-old twins. He'd also cleared his entire schedule, something he hadn't done in years because Doris had been right about one thing. If he was going to be present, he needed to actually be present. The address Doris had given him led to a modest apartment building in a neighborhood that housed young professionals and growing families. Wesley climbed 2 flights of stairs, his nerves increasing with each step, and knocked on a door that would either open to the beginning of redemption or the confirmation that some mistakes were permanent. Doris answered wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in the messy bun that had become her signature since becoming a mother. She looked tired but beautiful, and for a moment, Wesley forgot how to speak. "You came," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I said I would," Wesley replied, then looked around the small but perfectly organized space that had become his children's first home. Every surface showed evidence of life with twins. Burp cloths folded neatly on the couch, bottles drying by the sink, a changing station that looked like a military operation in its efficiency. The apartment was small but clean, filled with natural light from windows that overlooked a neighborhood park where children played on swings and slides. "They're napping," Doris whispered, leading him toward 2 cribs positioned by the largest window. "But they'll wake up soon. They're very consistent about their feeding schedule." Wesley approached his children with the same reverence he'd felt in his office. Grace and Lucas lay sleeping peacefully, their breathing soft and steady, tiny fists pressed against their cheeks in identical poses that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "How long do they usually sleep?" he whispered. "Another 15 minutes, maybe 20 if we're lucky," Doris replied, settling into a rocking chair that looked well used. "Long enough for you to tell me what you've been doing all week besides buying parenting books." Wesley had the grace to look embarrassed. "How did you know about the books?" "Because I know you, Wesley. You approach every challenge like it's a business problem that can be solved through research and preparation. But babies don't read the manuals. They have their own schedules and preferences that change constantly." "I want to be prepared," Wesley said defensively. "I want to understand what I'm doing before I do it wrong." "You're going to do things wrong," Doris said matter-of-factly. "Every parent does. The difference is whether you learn from the mistakes or get frustrated and give up when reality doesn't match your expectations." As if summoned by their conversation, Grace began to stir, making the small sounds that preceded full awakening. Doris stood immediately, lifting her with practiced ease and checking her diaper with automatic efficiency. "She's dry, so she's probably hungry," Doris observed, settling back into the rocking chair with Grace against her shoulder. "Can you hand me a bottle from the kitchen? They're in the refrigerator, already prepared." Wesley found himself in the role of assistant, following Doris's quiet instructions as she demonstrated the precise routine that kept two infants fed, clean, and content. Bottle temperature testing, burping techniques, the specific way Grace liked to be held during feeding versus the position Lucas preferred. "Can I try?" Wesley asked after watching Doris feed Grace with calm efficiency. "She's almost finished, but Lucas will wake up any minute," Doris said, glancing toward the second crib where stirring sounds suggested imminent consciousness. "You can feed him if you want." Lucas woke with a particular cry that meant immediate attention was required, and Doris guided Wesley through the process of lifting him, checking his diaper, and preparing for feeding. Lucas was smaller than Grace but more active, his tiny fists waving with indignation at being disturbed from sleep. "Support his head," Doris instructed, as Wesley settled into a chair with his son. "Test the bottle temperature on your wrist first. If it's too hot or too cold, he'll let you know immediately." Wesley offered the bottle with trembling hands, and Lucas latched on after a moment of suspicious examination. The feeling of feeding his son, of providing something essential and immediate, created a connection Wesley had never experienced. This tiny person depended completely on the adults around him for survival, and Wesley was being trusted with that responsibility. "He's strong," Wesley observed as Lucas gripped the bottle with surprising determination. "They both are," Doris agreed, settling Grace into a bouncy seat where she could observe the room with alert curiosity. "They've had to be. Premature twins often struggle more than single babies, but Lucas and Grace have exceeded every milestone their pediatrician set." "Premature?" Wesley felt his heart stop. "They were born early?" 36 weeks, Doris said quietly. "Not drastically premature, but early enough to require extra monitoring. They spent their first week in the NICU before coming home." Wesley felt the weight of everything he'd missed settle on his chest like a physical presence. His children had faced medical challenges in their first week of life, while he'd been completely unaware of their existence. Doris had navigated premature birth, NICU stays, and the terror that came with high-risk deliveries entirely alone. "I should have been there," he said, his voice barely audible. "You shouldn't have gone through that by yourself." "But you weren't there," Doris replied simply. "You were planning your wedding and expanding your empire. I dealt with it because that's what mothers do. We handle whatever needs handling." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of feeding, diaper changes, and careful instruction as Doris taught Wesley the basics of infant care. He learned that Grace was more sensitive to sound and preferred gentle rocking, while Lucas was more tactile and calmed down faster with firm pressure against his back. He discovered that burping required patience and specific positioning, that diaper changes could become wrestling matches, and that babies had very strong opinions about everything. But more importantly, Wesley began to understand the relentless nature of caring for twins. Every moment required attention and decision-making. Every cry needed interpretation. Every feeding led immediately to the next need in an endless cycle that left no room for distraction or delay. "How do you manage this alone?" Wesley asked as Doris demonstrated the precise swaddling technique that helped Lucas settle for sleep. "Very carefully," Doris replied honestly. "Some days are harder than others. Mrs. Patterson helps when she can, and the other nurses at work have been incredibly supportive. But Wesley, this is what parenthood actually looks like, not the cute moments that make good photos. The daily grind of keeping two small humans alive and thriving when they can't tell you what they need." As his visit neared its end, Wesley felt panic rising in his chest. 2 hours had passed like minutes, and he wasn't ready to leave his children again. The thought of returning to his empty penthouse while Doris managed everything alone made him feel physically ill. "When can I see them again?" he asked, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Next weekend if today went well," Doris said, studying his face carefully. "What did you think? Was it what you expected?" "It was harder and better than anything I could have imagined," Wesley said honestly. "I want to learn more. I want to be useful instead of just present. I want to help instead of just visiting." Something in his tone must have satisfied whatever test Doris had been conducting, because she nodded slowly. "We'll try twice a week next week, Wednesday evening and Saturday afternoon. But Wesley, I need you to understand something important. This gets harder before it gets easier. They're going to get sick. They're going to have sleep regressions. There will be nights when nothing works and days when you question everything. Are you prepared for that kind of commitment?" Wesley looked at his children, Grace sleeping peacefully in her crib and Lucas fighting the swaddle with determined persistence, and felt something fundamental shift in his priorities. These tiny people needed him in ways that had nothing to do with his wealth or business achievements. They needed consistency, presence, the kind of love that showed up every day regardless of mood or convenience. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it completely. "Whatever it takes, however difficult it gets, I want to be their father, really be their father." "Then prove it," Doris said simply. "Not through grand gestures or expensive gifts. Prove it by showing up consistently, by learning their needs, by choosing them over everything else that's always been more important to you." Wesley left Boston that evening with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. The drive back to Manhattan gave him time to think about the life he'd built that suddenly felt completely meaningless compared to 2 hours of feeding babies and learning the difference between hungry cries and tired cries. That night, in his penthouse apartment that echoed with emptiness, Wesley began making lists. Changes he needed to make. Priorities he needed to reorder. A life he needed to rebuild around what actually mattered. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but it had begun the moment he'd held Grace for the first time and realized that everything he'd thought was important was just expensive decoration around the real work of living. The next chapter of Wesley's redemption was about to begin, and it would test everything he thought he knew about sacrifice, commitment, and the difference between wanting to change and actually doing the work of becoming someone different. But that's a story for another moment, because right now, sitting in his empty apartment surrounded by the trappings of a success that felt hollow, Wesley was finally ready to learn what it meant to love someone more than he loved his own comfort. And that, more than any business achievement or pharmaceutical empire, was about to become the foundation of everything meaningful he would ever build.